Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of the Human Factor Security Podcast with me, Jenny Radcliffe, the People Hacker. I am so pleased today to welcome my guest, who is a fellow Scouser and is VP of Customer Delivery at Entersekt. Welcome to the show, Simon Rodway.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for inviting me on and to have this little chat.
Well, it's so good to see you. It's so good to see you. How? First of all, before obviously I've given you a brief introduction, but do you want to just tell us a little bit more about who you are and what your role is?
So, first of all, obviously Simon Rodway. I'm actually, as Jenny said, VP for Customer Delivery. Now, sounds quite grand, but basically that means my responsibility at Entersekt is delivering our solutions to our clients successfully. It's as simple as that. We deliver a lot of technology-based solutions, and sometimes that requires a little bit of thinking. And my job is to make sure that that thinking is done and we do it properly.
So that's really interesting to me, because obviously you must have seen huge sort of changes in 2020 with the pandemic and everything. I mean, what sort of broadly, what sort of changes has the business seen, and how are you trying to adapt to them?
Do you know, if we'd have sat here 12 months ago and said what was going to happen, we'd have just thought it was a Hollywood movie. We would have said those things are just not possible. The reality is what we're seeing is immense amount of change in a way that I guess 12 months ago just wasn't even conceived. The pace of change. We're now seeing the transition of what was and has been for many, many years, a very kind of manual process in a lot of banking and payment space. A lot of the industry has been, although they've prided themselves on digitization and on the transition into what they call hyper-personalization, the reality is it's only in the last 9 months that that's actually really started to happen. And we're now starting to see the product of that change. And that's kind of where, from my perspective, we're starting to see a significant change where people are having to switch to digital channels to do stuff.
I was going to say, was it about that we needed this like cataclysmic event, this sort of zero day in a way, like this kind of like global societal zero day to force people to adopt some of these technologies that like the security industry and the tech industry has been pushing for a few years, really.
No, absolutely. I mean, we know within the banking sector I can go back over 20 years of transitioning into digitization and digital systems within banking. And banks have been moving to online banking and online this and online that for quite a number of years. But the significant majority of their customer base has always still been kind of either telephone or branch banking, even though branches, the volumetrics and the numbers of branches have gone down. The reality is people trust physical, they trust the people, they trust the connection. You speak to certain demographics for sure, they wouldn't trust digital, but now there is no choice. Now there isn't a choice, now they have to. And once they've transitioned, one of the things we're seeing, certainly in some of those key demographics, is people are saying, actually, this is not as hard as I thought, or this is not as difficult as I thought, or in the face of no other option, they're getting on and doing it.
So, I wanted to talk to you about this side of things as well, because it does raise that question now, and I know this is something that you're passionate about and you talk about, of the people who just are left behind with that. I mean, I think about, my parents. I mean, we lost my mum sort of early this year, and in some ways it was a blessing, because it's hard for elderly people, for seniors, to cope in this kind of world. I mean, my mum would never have looked at a computer, and I know that's that vulnerability and there's two things really, isn't there? There's people who are very vulnerable and can't use the tech, and then there's people who are sort of tech impoverished and can't afford it and have no access to tech. So I think I suppose what's the question for you with all this mass adaptation and adoption of technology? What's your view on the vulnerable and the people who can't get access to it? I mean, how are we going to look at them as?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of that breaks down into a number of different groups, as you've already said. I mean, there's the tech impoverished, and in actual fact, in many ways, they're the easier group to deal with, because as a country, as a society, even as a world, there are ways we can go about actually looking at that kind of demographic and that kind of group and saying how we can deal with that. And we've seen this in the UK. We know that tech impoverished children, schools are now issuing them with laptops and tablets, etc. And the government have actually put a significant sum of money in to enable that to happen. And I guess even before COVID and before the pandemic, that was happening to some degree, but it's now certainly in the region that we live, we're seeing this actually more and more.
I think it's scatty though, Simon. Do you know, sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's scatty. I mean, I could from first-hand experience talk about, you know, I've seen less adaptation than I'd have expected, and I wonder if you're the same. I'd have thought by now, you know, we're recording this on Friday the 6th of November, right? So we're well into the UK's second national lockdown, although if you're like Simon and I, tier 3, just like welcome everyone else, doesn't feel that much different really, does it? But I'd have thought by now the schools that are being closed, that have had a blended or online solution, given what you've just said, given that there's the tech option, but it seems like they're slow to pick up on that even.
So on this very point, absolutely, on this very point, I mean, I've had a number of conversations with a number of secondary schools. My children are in secondary school. I've had a number of conversations with the school they're in, who have done, I have to say, have done a very good job in enabling kids in isolation. But even there, I would still argue that the quality of the service delivered is not good enough. And the reality is, we can go back. You can look at Australia. Australia 20 years ago were delivering educational services because they had to, because their children that they were teaching were 500 miles away. They couldn't do it face to face. So they developed a scheme whereby you could do this over CB radio, and then that's evolved into actual conferencing. And now we see within schools that they've switched into Google Classroom or various other services, and they're actually now providing education that way. But it's still, as you say, it is scatty, because why aren't they doing live broadcasts of lessons?
I get why it would, like, you'd have to do it in Australia because it's so remote, right? It's huge, gigantic place with lots of little pockets. I just feel as if you're right. You know, I think you're right. It's like, it amazed me that we couldn't get onto that, and that it was just so mixed in terms of performance. And there was something about money there and class, I think, because in the poorer areas, where there wasn't as much, you know, sort of seems to me that there wasn't as much cash, it was sort of more sporadic, whereas a lot of the private schools, that I've got friends with a lot of kids in private school, that was very smooth, and they kind of threw money at it and tech at it very, you know, because they were able to, and quite rightly.
But that demographic as well, that separation in demographic also raises a number of other questions, which is the reason I think why certain areas have been slow to respond. And that's the question of child protection. Because unfortunately, those challenges as well also impact the decisions that schools make. And unfortunately, that means that when you ask the question of why don't you do live broadcasts, and why can't you ensure that all the children are included, whether they're isolated or they're in the classroom, the reality stands that the school then have to ask the question, well, what about the child protection challenges that they face and the issues that they face in those areas? And
I just wondered whether you could give people the choice and say, like, you know, children at risk, children who didn't respond could go in, but you'd still empty huge swathes of the classroom. But I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking you this is because you work for the company, and I've been a long time in this industry. And as you say, it's 20, did you say 20 years? Is it more than 20 years?
More than 20 years, I'm afraid. More years than I care to remember.
Of presenting solutions for this type of thing, isn't it? It's like secure, like how to be more secure with the banking's one thing. And I suppose it's really one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you on the show is because it's such it's the mindset that you bring. It's that like solutions-based mindset. I mean, one of the things that you've sort of that we've spoken about in the research for the show is you've said that there's a lot of things actually that could do with simplifying and looking at in sort of with a more modern lens, with a technological, a digital lens, but not necessarily overcomplicated. And I just wondered about that, because I think when we hear things like overhaul and, the banking system or education. It sounds so complicated. But you strike me as someone who thinks that you can bring tech solutions in and the key is making it simple. I mean, would that be right?
Absolutely. So more years back than I can care to remember, I started working within the education authority, and one of the tasks I was given back then, nearly 30 years ago, was how to teach or how to educate the teachers on using IT. And back then, the technology was somewhat what you would class as archaic compared to today. But the answer was still the same. How do you do this? And it's simple. You get the 10-year-old, you teach the 10-year-old, and they'll teach the teacher. And that worked. Because
because they're more open? Oh, sorry, go on. You were about to say, I was going to say, is that because their mind's more open or because they've grown up with it?
100%,
or
no, 100%. They're more familiar with it and they're more inquisitive. Okay, so if you think about that in terms of that inquisitive nature, just stopping and asking the question often gives you a time to think, okay, well, what could be the answer? So I'll give you a good example, right? Okay, you know Michael McIntyre, a great comedian. So he did a sketch a while ago on online ticket sales. If you'd be able to YouTube, it'd be on YouTube.
Okay, we'll put a link.
Yeah, and in his sketch, he was referring to booking a ticket at the local cinema.
Right. And
in the ticket purchase process, he has to fill out what country he's in, and what the address is, and all of those kind of things. And he goes on and said, "Why on earth does Azerbaijan have to be on the address list of his local cinema? Because at the end of the day, no one from Azerbaijan is going to be going to his local cinema, and if they are, they're not going to be traveling from Azerbaijan to his local cinema." So. But the essence of the challenge there is that more often than not, technologists see a problem and solve it, and we solve it in a way that we think is logical and sensible. But when it's then the end user, the consumer, the individual picks up, they think that makes no sense. No. And Michael McIntyre in his sketches, except he's absolutely spot on. He's right. Just because it's logical to ask for country and then city or region and then street and then number and so on and so forth, because logically that follows, doesn't mean that's how, as a human, you think.
No. And I see this, I think it's so right, and I see this with so many applications, because I am an absolute sworn non-technical person. I'm a social engineer. I just work with people, and if technology is even remotely complicated, my brain's stupid enough to be fooled immediately. And I think I'm not sure if it is Michael McIntyre, but I think it might be, where he says you have to say the name of the film you want to watch, and then it just thinks it's something else.
So he did a number of things, even those squiggly words that you get, and you've got to try and work out from this word pattern.
Oh, capture.
Scrambled letters, captures, and type in anything. And what on earth is this that you type in? So there's as technologists, these are all things that we can use to what we think is the right thing to do to secure the engagement and ensure that the person is safe. But from their perspective, it's like, this is just more of a challenge. It's more of a hurdle. It's more of a stumbling block. So I go back to your original point on the demographics, and you think about those in elderly people. So unfortunately, similar to yourself losing your mum, we've just recently lost dad, and that's raised a whole load of things. Not least, he had a computer with a load of stuff on.
Yeah.
We don't know his password. How do we get into it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's so many things that you don't think about from a security. You put a hurdle, a challenge, a check in on these things, and then you come at it from the opposite side. You come at it from the consumer side, the client side, the person who's actually going to be using this thing, and invariably they never use it the way you design it. And that's one of the challenges, one of the big challenges as a technical solutions architect that we have to stop and ask ourselves is, the things that we're building, do they actually make sense?
Yeah.
And unfortunately...
And you only know, don't you? It's like a beta, isn't it? You only know after you tested it with, and how many, couple of hundred, couple of thousands, and by then it's out there and it's sort of in the wild and people are finding fault with it. I mean, I think it's that security by design, and certainly you know, anything that's not user friendly stops being secure in a way. And I don't know if you agree with this, but one of the things I always say to people as a social engineer is I say, I watch a target. Well, I mean, I used to in the before times when we all were allowed out. But, you know, I'd watch a target building. And very often I wouldn't have to think of anything really about how, I wouldn't have to think my way in. I'd just watch for employees and what they did to get around whatever security or whatever was in place that was inconvenient and just follow them. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's people will get their own get arounds. And I suppose in some ways people say, well, that's the users playing up. But it's just human nature, I think.
No,
so is the answer to security by design then? Sorry, come on.
So the security has to be embedded into the initial thinking of all the things that you're actually starting to do. It shouldn't even be a question anymore. It should be a factor of whatever it is you're building. That it should just be part of the natural thought process. If you're building something that's got sensitive information or personally identifiable information, or you're doing some kind of payments process or whatever it is, then fundamental to that thinking should be, okay, that's important information to somebody. How do I protect it? How do I secure it? What do I do? And how do I ensure that it's protected in a way that's suitable for the situation at hand, without making it impossible for the people that are going to use this to actually operate?
But I was going to say, but we know that that's only true if you've got time and money and resource. Well, I say time and money because one of the things I'd say is look at the track and trace app. And the money that's been spent on it is someone walking around with like 10 billion quid in the back pocket. Because I was looking at that and I thought, this is a geographical overlay of something. It could even be like, it does remind me of Pokemon or a dating app or something that shows me where people are. And I was thinking, this is odd. But security wasn't. I mean, they said it was built into it, but then you have people. I mean, it wasn't really. So I don't know if people always do. I think it depends on how rushed you are. Is I suppose my point.
I guess when your back is against the wall, a lot of things you will do to just try and get over the line. And I think, unfortunately, with the track and trace system, certainly the UK implementation of track and trace, there are obviously a number of questions that have been asked and continue to be asked about its capability. And there are organizations in the world that have already had already come up with solutions that had already been tried and tested. And there are questions there which you're now venturing into more political challenges.
Oh yeah, because it was political that we did it, and we did our beta in the Isle of Man, was it? It was the Isle of Wight.
Yeah. The Isle of Wight, was it? It was the Isle of Wight, down south.
Yeah.
But anyway, but the truth of the matter is, from a technology perspective, it's using technology that has been around for a while. It's not new technology they're using. They're just using it in a different way. Now, with all of those things, the challenge with it is maintaining the security, but whilst still maintaining the I guess the fluidity and flexibility of the platform. Now, in the German implementation, we can look into this because I've actually had a look at this to some degree. The way that operates is much more, in my mind, more from a technology perspective, more efficient than the UK implementation. But the reality is, I don't think we're actually really going to know the truth for this for another 3 or 4 months, if the truth be known.
Yeah, sure.
So we just have to wait and see how that pans out. But it is difficult, and within the technology frameworks that we work from an organization, we have to deal with both mobile technology and how that operates. This sort of technology, I mean, for goodness sake, 9 months ago, everyone jumped on Zoom. We're doing Zoom. And Zoom is now synonymous as much as with engaging with people as, I guess, Hoover is with the vacuum cleaner. It's kind of, let's do Zoom. And the truth is, how secure is this? When Zoom first started becoming so prevalent in the consumer market back in March, there was a plethora of news articles and conferences. In fact, I even think, if I remember rightly, the UK government had to cancel.
Yeah, they were gate crashed, weren't they? Cabinets. And I think what you said though what you said just then is so true. It's like you said, put when your back's against the wall, everybody. I've done numerous talks at conferences and things about it. It's like everybody was reacting. Do you remember those first days of lockdown and leading up to lockdown? It was just confusion. It was panic. Everyone, people were trying to do their best under very difficult, changing new circumstances. And mistakes were made. People just wanted to get the communications out. I think without getting too political, because we don't want to get political, but I think the problem that people have with that is that there was plans in place, there should have been plans in place and of exactly what to do. But then it's back to the first point that we made was until something actually lands, I think sometimes people it doesn't, you don't get that kick up the backside really until it actually happens, and then people mass adopt, and then that's your real big beta test, I guess, at that point. Yeah. So I get that. Absolutely. I mean, just on the coronavirus and technology, Simon, if that's okay, because like you say, because it's that brain of yours, that logic that I'm interested in. Obviously, fellow Scouser, not too far away from where either of us are sitting right now, in, would you believe, in Pontins in Southport. Our armed forces, who have faced great difficulties and challenges over the years, are now facing the difficulty of sleeping in Pontins as well. And I don't apologise for saying that. I've stayed there. Don't eat the chicken. Because we've got this Moonshot project in Liverpool, don't we? And what I know that you can just, right, so I checked this before we started this talk because I wanted to ask you about it. If you don't display symptoms, you can just walk into one of the centres. There's one at the Albert Dock, there's one in Wavertree. If you're not displaying symptoms, Simon, you can walk in and you can get your test, okay? So this is the Moonshot. This is trying to test everyone in Liverpool City region, whether or not you've got symptoms, in order to try and get a better picture of the data from one of the worst affected places in the UK. So you can just walk in if you haven't got it. But to know that, I had to go to 3 or 4 websites, right? If you've got symptoms, you really do have to make an appointment on the phone. And you can only know that and know if you've got to isolate if you've got the app. Now, there are other ways, but I just wanted to get back to the whole idea of life is so much easier if you're connected. What if you're not connected again? It's like you said, I suppose we should be thankful that the pandemic hit in a connected age. And I just wondered what all these issues made you think of as someone who looks at solutions and looks at customer experience. What's your thoughts on all of this?
So I mean, the truth of the matter is, if this had have happened even 20 years ago, okay, and we did have pandemics in the world, but not to this degree. If this had have happened 20 years ago, where do you think we would have been from a mental health perspective? Yeah. Because that would be true isolation. That would be the only form of communication you had was a landline phone.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be the only thing you had. Now we've got mobile technology. We've got the ability to do video conferencing. We've got this whole premise of Zoom. You can do WhatsApp, FaceTime. There's so many different ways of connecting. There's so many different ways of connecting. And the reality is, with that, at least it's afforded us a momentary break in a lockdown space where you can actually connect with somebody. The challenge we face, though, is there's no physical connection, and the human nature is a nature that requires physical connection. Yeah. And unfortunately, that is also the vehicle by which the pandemic spreads. So I noticed the Apple on their new Apple iOS update.
Yeah.
So if you've got a smartwatch or something, it'll now tell you every so often, go and wash your hands. So technology is now telling us this is what we need to do. So not just around track and trace when your phone's being in close proximity to somebody else, it's going to tell you to isolate, but also it's going to start saying, look, go and wash your hands, or now's the time to do this, etc. And I think technology has had a big play. I think it's going to have an increasing play. One of the things that we're starting to see, and you'll start to see more of this actually, is back in March, the various organizations, financial organizations, were working on some major projects. They've all been shelved. Those big projects have all been shelved. and shelved in favour of what? It's quite simple. And we can quote this directly from the FCA, because they've basically said that all prioritization of key projects should now focus on frontline operational processes to ensure ongoing critical customer support and service, the service is maintained. So the focus is quite clear. Focus on people. Make sure that the people are safe, secure, and if that means that we can start to use technology to connect with people. I mean, I don't know how many people you know, but where I live, I can walk down the street and nearly everybody's now got a Ring doorbell or a Nest doorbell, so that when someone comes to the door, they can still connect with them, but they're connecting with them over Zoom or whatever. There's still an engagement. So I think the reality is it's not 20 years ago. Thank God it is now. But there is still this demographic, there is still this group, I guess, my parents, who are truly disconnected. And there has to be a way of us being able to help them. Now, one of the things that I've done with my mum is we installed an Alexa.
Yeah.
And we've changed all the lights, so the lights are now connected to Alexa, and they're all smart. And now she can sit in her chair and she can talk to the television and she can talk to the lights. This probably sounds like it's going to make life a lot easier. In many ways it is. And with that technology, it is making things a lot more helpful. I have to say, from a mental health perspective, I am questioning a few things there, because she's now talking to the lights.
Yes. Yes, I have a relative the same. It's like just like Star Trek, as far as they're concerned. They can't believe it. And they think, I mean, I think my mum, just did see our Alexa for a little while, and I think she did think it was just witchcraft, and we didn't really get to use it to help as much as you obviously have. But I mean, I think one of the things is to use that technology and use it safely. And I know that you have a lot to do with sort of like digital identity and sort of products and services that like look at those patterns and things and check, like, so, check that sort of abnormalities in the pattern, so like if your mum suddenly came up with a load of technical language and stuff, I mean, how does that's a way to protect people who aren't used to this technology. We're starting to bring them on, trying to show them some basic things to help keep them safe and make their life easier. But I know that Entersekt and yourself look at solutions. I mean, I don't know much about it, but you look at those kind of algorithmic solutions, don't you, for consumer behavior and stuff. Do you think that's the answer to keeping people secure when they're using this new stuff and getting used to it then? Is it looking at the human behavior?
Yeah. First of all, there's no silver bullet to all of this, because with everything, there's going to be nuances and bits that we look at. But again, it goes back to keep it simple. And if these things can be done without you even being aware of it, and they're being done to protect you, then they're there for your benefit. And if that can be done so that, I mean, just take your home assistants, whatever that might be, whether it's Alexa or Google Assist or whoever it is. Yeah. You teach it your voice, so that
slowly, in my case, with the accent, but yes, we do.
And then as a consequence, when the kids say, Alexa, go and order something from whatever, it'll say, well, no, because you're not that, so you can't. And that's very, very basic. But think about that in terms of the online space, where we can do continuous authentication, continuous assessment. We can do things like delegated authority, where we can not just say that for maybe someone who's technically challenged, they can go so far, and then they can pass that over to somebody else digitally. So as an example, mum could order something through her Alexa, and then I get the notification to confirm it, to make sure that everything's good and safe, and we're not physically in the same place. And there's ways to actually enable this to happen, so that we can have a conversation. She can just speak and we can have that conversation. And we can connect even though we're not in the same room. And all of this makes life easier. And from a security perspective, digital identity is going to play a bigger part. And you will start to see this change over the next 6 months for sure, especially in all of your financial engagements. Because the reality is, although there's been a significant drive over the last 2 or 3 years with what was called PSD2, Payment Services Directive, and the introduction of what was called strong customer authentication, and the ability to authenticate you in a way that made the bank convinced or the e-commerce provider convinced it was you.
Yeah.
The opposite side, and this is where the ECB and the various FCA regulations are going now, to say, look, it's the bank's responsibility to look after you as a consumer, and the focus should be on the kind of the maintaining a successful service, but customer supported, customer centric, and think about the customer. So it has to work for you as an individual. So digital identity in the past has been, in many ways, quite a challenge for organizations. In the UK, we don't have a successful government-backed digital identity scheme. There's been a number of attempts. There isn't a successful one yet. In other countries, there has been. So in the Nordics, they have something called Bank ID, which now means that they can authenticate themselves in an online space. And from the day they're born, they're given their Bank ID, and they grow up with it. So even people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s know Bank ID because they've been familiar with it for like 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that familiarity puts them in a stronger place today. Whereas here, we haven't got that.
No.
Our 60-plus-year-olds are not familiar with it, and it's not something that is kind of day-to-day experience. But in the next 6 months, we're definitely going to start to see some of this change. On the e-commerce side, there's a drive towards delegated auth, so that the e-commerce providers can start to make that authentication decision that they know it's you, because it's your buying pattern. If you always go to a particular store and you always buy in a particular way, if that's your groceries and you go to the supermarket, they now know it's you. They can trust it's you. They're delivering the goods to you so that they can take some of that risk on themselves.
And that's dynamic, I guess, is it always updates and always checking that pattern?
Yeah, correct. So, and then if you start to buy things that you don't normally buy, then that can raise the alert level and so on and so forth. And as that alert level goes up, once it gets over the threshold, they can say, okay, we need to check this. We need to go to another form of identity, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of where we're heading. And I guess some of these implementations, some of these deliveries take 6 months to come to life. Well, a lot of organizations, a lot of banks, a lot of e-commerce companies switched to start doing this in March when they were suddenly told, lockdown, you can't do anything. Everyone's got to work from home. All of a sudden, it's like, well, okay, how do we maintain business? And a lot of those projects have now switched into these programs, and we're now starting to see this coming forward.
I mean, I see that, and I see the financial sector do move quickly when they need to, and I guess that adaptation's good. And it's interesting what you say there, because I never considered a cultural element to the adoption of stuff like that. But of course, if you talk about the Nordics, they would be less rebellious in some ways than we would be about anything that was to do with identity or anything. Well, Simon, look, it's fascinating talking to you. I just to finish off, I wonder what you're focusing on yourself and what are you passionate about going forward in the next year or so? I mean, where do you think the attention will be? Where's your attention going to be? From a technological point of view, what is it that you're going to focus on and you think is important going forward?
So from my perspective, digital identity, which we've already touched on, is going to play a big part. And the way that that's conceived, the way identity is conceived, is going to change in my mind. And certainly that's where my passion is at the moment, that we look and see how can we secure individuals in the things that they're doing in a way that's doesn't actually invade everything that they do. It's only present when it needs to be. And that's one of the key areas. The other aspect that we're seeing is something I mentioned earlier, which was this hyper personalization, which is how do we make services that you're engaging with relevant to you? And part of that is when we look at this risk process we talked about, how we do continuous risk, there's the inverse of that. There's the benefit of that. Once you've got a profile, once you've been able to build a profile, then we can use that to say, okay, there's no point in presenting to Jenny all of these particular things because she's not interested in those. She can look at these things or she can look at that. And I know this exists today because if you go to Amazon, what comes up is the first things that you've probably spoken about.
Yeah,
random.
or like it's listening, Simon, it's listening. Like I had a conversation about, I'll tell you what, this is how I know it's listening. I had a conversation, phone was in the kitchen, about a tagine. Do you know Moroccan tagine? Lamb and apricot thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we had lamb, and I said, oh, I've always fancied trying a tagine, but I don't have one of them special. And I said, tagine, witch's hat cooking dishes. I said, my friend's got one. She said it was very good. And I went into Amazon that night with nothing. I've never looked at it before, never thought, what's the first thing that come up as a suggestion? And it's like, I think that's why people are a little bit distrustful, because you just think that is just so creepy.
You're right, it is. And I can probably tell you a number of other stories along the same lines. I can probably tell you some research I've also been involved in where we've actually tested some of these things, even to the point where the devices are physically turned off.
See,
and it still works. So, but not to feed the conspiracy theories.
No.
But certainly to look at really the true benefit of what this is. And so long as your identity and your personal information is protected and you're in control of it. So there was a movement or a discussion some year or two ago around what was called self-sovereign identity, which is putting the things that are valuable to you in your hand and not in the hand of somebody else. So the argument around the likes of Facebook owns your data and stuff, that completely changes, because they don't. In the self-sovereign identity model. In the self-sovereign identity model, you own it, and you delegate that to people. And you delegate aspects of that to people. And that's kind of, I still honestly believe that that's where things are going. And if you look at the way Apple are doing their identity services now, that's the model that they're following, or a form of that model anyway. So
it's just a balance, isn't it? It's the balance between knowing me so well and knowing that they sort of there's a certain amount of eavesdropping and tracking going on, like in some of the documentaries and things that you see, and also having that very granular marketing, which is of course appreciated, because last thing I want is, I don't know, a load of stuff about cricket or something that I don't care about really.
You
but
don't
like
care
the husband, no, but but like I emphatically don't, because the husband is fanatical, you see.
Okay.
So that's why that one came to mind, because obviously that's the most important thing about the whole pandemic, is the fact that the cricket's not what it was. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Simon. And it's just, as I say, be somebody that we can ask about these things, complex issues, complex world, but perhaps simpler solutions if we think about people than perhaps we sometimes imagine. So I really appreciate the clarity on that. And stay safe at this dangerous time. Look forward to following the progress of the type of things you're talking about. Where can people find out more about the type of things that you're working on? I mean, we'll flash up Entersekt's website, but how about yourself? Is it LinkedIn, or how do people find out more?
So the easiest way to connect is connect through LinkedIn. Obviously, we appear on LinkedIn fairly frequently, and there's a lot of blogs that are getting posted and various things that our marketing team quite often have me write and sign off on. So by all means, join me on LinkedIn. Always happy to engage and have conversations with whoever wants to talk about some of this stuff. It is fun. It is interesting. It is a challenging time. That's true. But let's make the most of it while we can.
Oh, well, listen, Simon, it's been an absolute joy and a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much for being a guest on the Human Factor Security Podcast. Simon Rodway.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching or listening to the Human Factor Security Podcast with your host, Jenny Radcliffe, the People Hacker. Find us at www.humanfactorsecurity.co.uk, on YouTube as the Human Factor Security channel, and on social media as the People Hacker, Jenny Radcliffe. For sponsorship, guests and other inquiries, please email enquiries@humanfactorsecurity.co.uk.